My hair is getting increasingly disheveled every video. Today we are stepping away a little bit from the philosophy and talking about politics and economics. Aside from religion, that's probably the most contentious stuff I can talk about. The reason for this is quite simple because, again, I try to emphasize every time in these videos that business is one of these sectors of the world, of our common experience, that basically touches everything. It's a very diverse type of thing. And it really pays to have some common understanding of all the topics involved before we actually get into operationalizing this. So this is still explaining stuff. This is not necessarily talking about what kind of conclusions I am drawing from this. But we will be talking about politics in general, ideologies, economics, and of course our favorite topic, capitalism. Most of you will be fairly familiar with American politics because honestly I too follow American politics probably more than local politics, even though I'm very interested in Dutch politics as well. Now, often when topics are discussed, individual topics, there is this idea that topics can be political or non-political. So there's such a thing as a neutral topic or just a general topic, and then there's political topics. And often if you just mention a certain type of topic, that is immediately branded as political, and you probably shouldn't do that. Now, of course, it is sort of true. You probably shouldn't just out of the blue start talking politics to people. A large part of this is politics is very preference driven and also really touches on things that people truly believe and are very hard to sway from. So those are the kinds of topics you can probably get an argument over and not really improve your relationships, right? In this video I would like to emphasize that the meaning of politics, there is a technical meaning to this. And politics is strictly the realm of power, distribution of power, and in a sense, justification of power. So when we're talking about something in a political sense, we're not necessarily talking about economics or social dynamics or that kind of stuff. Those things do get into it because, of course, those are the things we assign power to. But really, it is about seeing who has power and who hasn't got power and how we go about distributing power. So political systems are clearly about distribution of power. For instance, if we talk about something like monarchy, so a single ruler has all the power to make the rules for other people, but generally wields power. How that power is expressed, that's kind of a different thing. Likewise, a democracy is, theoretically at least, a place where all the constituents wield the power and basically devolve their power to a small subset of people just to make rulemaking easier. But the real power lies with the people. So that is a purely political system, but of course there are different implementations of how you do these things. And we kind of all know that there are like forms of democracy that are more democratic than others, right? Just saying something is a democracy is saying something is food. It's almost meaningless. Also, like saying something is a monarchy is sort of meaningless because the Netherlands is a monarchy, but we're also a democracy, so that's kind of interesting. But people don't just have technical definitions in their head of when you say, oh, Yemen is a monarchy. Okay, that means that there's just the one guy ruling everybody. Now, that's not what we think about in our heads, right? We put value judgments on these things. And generally speaking, in the modern world, saying something is a democracy is seen as a positive thing. So saying you are a democracy is something that is valuable to you, even if you really aren't a real democracy. So if we're talking about democracies, if you take, for instance, the US, the US has a very, very complicated democratic system that is non-proportional, that is intrinsically non-proportional. So that means that even though everybody has votes, and those votes are genuinely the thing that underlies the choice of representatives that ultimately make the rules. Not all votes are counted equally, and they're not consistently counted equally. And this is done through a whole Byzantine system of systems that make up all the rules of both elections and the actual distribution of power in the US. Now, a more proportional system would be, for instance, the Netherlands, where every vote indeed is, like, apart from the Hond method of distributing extra votes, every vote is sort of weighted the same. But also not quite. So there's this idea that if you just let everybody choose their own representative, you ultimately get a true representation of the will of the people. But if we look at a lot of themes, so if you start polling, for instance, in the Netherlands, for themes what people think about a certain topic, and then see what the kind of rulemaking is around that topic at the same time, there is still quite a significant discrepancy. So to say that democracy accurately projects power from the people onto the people, I should say, that's not necessarily true either. So again, political systems can be quite complicated and quite hard to figure out. However, they are still ultimately about distributing power. Now, the way this power is distributed, it's got some system to it as well, right? So politics generally clusters around a couple of ideas that kind of motivate the people that work in politics. These ideas, they are structured ideas. This is what we call ideologies. So an ideology is kind of a structured bunch of ideas. Often it has true philosophical underpinnings, true ethical underpinnings. So for instance, leftist people believe that, at least in the context of wielding power and receiving rulemaking and in terms of rights, is equal. So people are not literally equal, but people are equivalent, so gelijkwaardig in Dutch. You can work from that axiomatic basis, as I talked about in the epistemology video. You take those axioms and you construct a framework, and there are various types of left-leaning and leftist frameworks, but all of them more or less work from the same axioms at the bottom. Now, at the other end of the spectrum, there is the ideology of conservatism. So generally speaking, progressivism or leftism and conservatism are the big two kind of large ideologies. And conservatism fundamentally believes that people are different, so intrinsically different. And as I talked about in the ethics video, this reeks a little bit of virtue ethics, right? So the conservative idea is that people are inherently good at something or bad at something, and that ultimately the whole constellation of things they are good and bad at will shape them, and they are ultimately responsible by themselves for their own destiny. Likewise, a large part of conservative ideology, and this is where the form progressivism, and to a lesser extent, this is not very common to say about conservatives, but regressivism or simply conservatism. These terms mean that progressives generally think that you can make things better, right? So things right now might not be optimal, and we can, from basically the top-down perspective, we can project power in such a way to make things better. Conservatives generally want to conserve the status quo. And there are different ideologies, again, in this. So, again, conservatism is quite a complex ideology, progressivism quite a complex ideology, and there are many different types. But generally speaking, conservatives want to keep things the way they are. So these underpinnings are often the true ideologies. So this is often called an operational ideology, something you use all the time. Like if you don't quite know what's going on, you go back to this foundation, and then you construct ideology from there. So, for instance, a libertarian person, when confronted with an economic problem, will commonly say that the source of this problem is probably too much interference into the the free hand of the market, and we will talk about that too. Now, those base ideologies are often very consistent, and these are really like the intellectual ideologies. So these are ideologies proposed by the large names in politicology, like Adam Smith and Ayn Rand and Karl Marx and these kinds of things, right? Then there's also this idea of a more practical approach to politics, and these are often called meta-ideologies. So for instance, if we're talking about American politics again, there is this certain party in the US that in the upper house has the meta-ideology of basically disapproving of and trying to block everything that the other party is doing. This is called political obstructionism, and obstructionism is a kind of a meta political ideology. It is not motivated by true ideology of we are either trying to be progressive or conservative. Well, maybe you could say it is the ultimate conservative position, that we want to keep everything the same and block any kinds of rules from being made at all. But really, even conservative people understand that there is a need for rulemaking and for adapting to things that happen in the world, right? They have this extra layer of meta ideology that says we just want to block everything the other party is doing. This is a common thing in small parties in parliamentary systems as well. They often have this very practical way of looking at politics, like even if a certain rule isn't quite great, but they can get something through that they want, they will try to massage a certain rule in such a way that they kind of can approve and then go along with larger parties on a purely practical point, even if it is not ideologically driven. And of course, this meta-politics and generally politics is just very common. This is, I'm not making any value judgments here. This is a common thing. I'm talking about this very negative example from the US, but that's just one that you can see very obviously. But it goes on all the time. And there we see that politics and the politics of power are not just driven by ideology, it's also driven by other things. And one of the most important things that I want to talk about, that I just want to say out loud, is that there are incentives. So incentives is probably a video I can do all by itself. But incentives ultimately are the things that make you do something. If you don't have any incentives, by the way, that is also an ideological thing. There's this idea that people without incentives are not going to be productive. That's an Ayn Rand libertarian thing. The incentives, especially in politics, don't necessarily fully dictate what people will do, but they will kind of nudge people one way or the other. So it's not just ideology, it's not just practical politics or current events that happen, there's also other incentives. A lot of people think of incentives as just essentially bribery, so things like donations, party political donations, or lobbying, but those are not nearly all the incentives that people in politics have, and not nearly all the incentives you have to think of in politics. To start, there's this concept of elections. Every few years you have to be electable, so you have to do things that are popular to your constituents, and that is an incentive as well, and probably in most functioning democracies this is the largest incentive. So shifting from actual power politics to just a general idea of politics in most people's mind, and again, these ideas of some particular topics being political. So for instance, 20 to 30 years ago, the topic of gay people and the starting LGBT community back then, that was a big political topic. This was ultimately about disenfranchisement or re-enfranchisement of a particular group of people, which is, let's say, kind of arbitrarily chosen, right? Why should we care about what people like to do sexually? Doesn't really make sense, and often this is the case in politics. Things don't necessarily make sense from an objective point of view or from a technical point of view. It is just the topic du jour that is going on. Now, there's a lot you can tell from these topics. So, first of all, it is currently very internationalized. A lot of political topics are common around the world. And this is just because of our interconnected world. But still, you can often tell the kind of the level of social progress that a country is at by the types of topics that are discussed in politics. Because politics, it's a moving plane. We are currently not talking about banishing Roman Catholics from the Netherlands. That is just not a thing that anybody has on their mind. But it was a large topic from like between 1860 and 1920. So not necessarily banishing Roman Catholics, but talking about their place in society and their intrinsic values and virtues. Likewise, we are not going to talk about going to war with Thracia, because that's something we did 2,400 years ago. It's just not a current topic. So politics really is about sort of current topics, and not just any current topic. It's the topics that are at the edge of our political ethics. And so these topics are a reflection of where we are as a society at this point in time. Now, funnily enough, this like topical nature, this newsy nature of politics is quite modern. It's a more modern conception of politics than we've usually had. And this also goes into this previous topic of political ideology and the meta-ideologies that we have. That traditionally politics was a very conservative, not conservative in the political sense, but conservative in the technical sense, pursuit. So the people who were in politics often had ideas for most of their life, and they were just trying to put those ideas into practice through politics. And in a modern sense, politics has become a profession, first of all, so professionalization of politics is a big topic. But also politics has become more a current affairs thing, and reacting to current affairs instead of trying to steadily implement some kind of political ideology. Alright, now let's leave politics there for a bit and start talking about economics. So, this was actually the first topic I was talking about, and like politics, a lot of people think about politics more in an operational sense. So in the topics that might be political and the ways you express politics, but really drilling down to this point that politics is about distributing power is important in understanding that that's like your foundation, and then you can build up from there, instead of trying to kind of use this constellation of disparate things and then construct your own version of politics from there. That makes it harder to understand other people talking about politics. Now, likewise in economics, if you just construct economics from, for instance, a politico-economic perspective. So if you just have this preferred framework, for instance, you might be a political conservative who is very much pro-business, right? And if you are that, it is very hard for you to conceptualize economics as a whole, and other ideas that might be contrary to your ideas as legitimate ideas in economics. You might just see them as wrong economics. Likewise, if you are an anarcho-communist, an ANCOM, and that is just your absolute belief, you might even have very good ideas about how to construct that belief from your ethical, philosophical underpinnings. You might just see capitalism as the wrong system and not as a legitimate way of looking at economics. But both of those are economic systems, and there are many more, and there are many more ways of expressing economic ideas. So it is important to understand what economics really is, and then work from there, right? So without further ado, economics is about satisfying demand using some kind of limited supply, and how we go about all of this. So fundamentally, It is about things of value and things that can be supplied and demanded in a material sense. And now, material doesn't necessarily mean physical, doesn't necessarily mean things. It also means services, but those services are still considered material. This is fundamentally different from, for instance, religion, where you are just dealing with ideas, or ideology, I suppose. So where in politics we are dealing with the concept of power, so the concept of somebody being able to impose their will or their rules on somebody else. In economics we are talking about material goods and how we supply those from one person to another or from one institution to another. The entirety of all goods and services and the people doing productive work and the institutions that function in that whole, that entirety is what we call an economy. And to be clear, an economy doesn't necessarily mean money, and it doesn't even necessarily mean services or goods. An economy is just the whole of value production. And so, for instance, we can genuinely talk about the economy of a caveman world, where there's no such thing as immaterial money or fiat currency. There is just trade, and I mean, trade goes on all the time. There is such a thing as social trade. So, for instance, saying, yeah, I will watch your kids tomorrow if you can watch them today while I do something else. That is a type of trade, is a very direct barter type of trade. But of course we can trade in all kinds of ways. So trade, again, is an emergent phenomenon of an economy, because demand and supply are, even if they are local, they are often not matched. And matching that requires some kind of coordinated movement of stuff. And that's what we call trade, right? Fundamentally, that's all it is. So if trade is an emergent phenomenon, then likewise markets are an emergent phenomenon of economies. Often this is because a certain good or service is not available locally and not even in a fairly large radius. And when somebody has basically everything they immediately need, there's always this thing that people want more, or they see something that they want. People have wants and needs and dreams and desires. And if they see something very far away, or they hear of something very far away that satisfies some kind of need, they are willing to pay for, well, if they can afford it, right? They are willing to pay for that thing to come to them. And therefore there is some kind of intrinsic value in closing the gap of supply and demand. And that is something that we can exploit. So if there are enough people on the demand side and the supply side, that we can create some kind of middle ground where these goods are traded, then we can construct what is called a market, where prices are set to some kind of reasonable middle, where the supplier is making some kind of useful enough profit that they can justify having to travel very far to bring something, and that the buyer can sort of justify buying it because it's cheaper than doing it themselves, for instance. Now again, markets seem to be a fundamental but emergent property of economies. Likewise, money probably is a fundamentally but emergent property of economies, because it's very hard to do direct barter, and we don't actually have that much evidence historically of direct barter being a whole system of trade in an economy. Money or some kind of token, IOUs, checks, or even just having an internal ledger in your mind of what you gave somebody and what you got back at some point. These things, this is all a kind of money, and money is just like a middleman, a universal type of carrier of value that you can use to negotiate trades. So I'm telling you all of this because, like in previous videos, there are some large misconceptions about what we can actually change about economies and political economies to make things better. So inherently, money is not a good or bad thing, markets are not a good or bad thing, and inherently money and markets are not capitalism. And so with that we come to the giant topic of capitalism. Now first of all, this is a widely understood and misunderstood topic. So I watch a lot of YouTube videos and other media about capitalism and all kinds of adjacent topics. And often this media basically just states capitalism as a thing that exists, that has a good definition, and that basically everybody knows. So you don't have to really talk about it. They can just talk about other things that are caused by capitalism without really defining it well. So this is because, contrary to popular belief, capitalism isn't actually a very well-defined term, technical term. So the topic of capitalism, it's has evolved over the last roughly 300 years. Back when Adam Smith, by the way, Adam Smith lived in the 18th century, so 1780-ish is when most of his most well-known work was published. So if you think this is a very modern thing, it's actually relatively old. Adam Smith way predates people like Karl Marx. Back then, capitalism was sort of defined in terms of course, capital, but the capital was literally just money in the bank, right? It was just like savings or something that you could use to set up a business and make some profit. And that is very different from how we conceptualize capitalism these days. Often the capital in capitalism is seen as a very, very broad definition of what capital can be. So capital can be physical capital, things like factories and machines and that kind of stuff. Labor is also a form of capital. That's often called human capital or a human resource. And then there's actual natural resources, which can also be constructed as capital. And all of this capital is what ultimately generates value in the economy that can then be traded on markets to fulfill demand. Now that's sort of a very, very simplistic view of current capitalism, but it's not just that. Capital isn't just this definitional thing. Capitalism actually has some ethics behind it as well. So a very central theme in capitalism from the start and basically all throughout now is this concept of self-interest, or more accurately, rational self-interest. So the idea that a market isn't just constructed from a supply and demand. It's not just this emergent thing that just happens and constructs itself from an imbalance between supply and demand. Markets also have these other emergent properties like rational self-interest and information. So a rationally self-interested actor in capitalism has this concept of information about everything that is available and then makes the best choice based on certain criteria. And these criteria are often just straight up price. So the fundamental way that markets regulate themselves is through price. And one of the central themes about this concept of price, you may know price is not the same as value. Value is what we conceive of the actual value to us of something, and the price is just an amount of currency that we pay for it. The cost is something different entirely. That is what it costs to make something. And because these three things are mismatched, the rational, self-interested actor in the market tries to get the price as close to the cost as possible if they are a consumer, and the price as close to the value as possible if they are the producer or the supplier. This is how markets are conceptualized in capitalism. Now, naturally, these are antagonistic relationships between the supplier and the consumer. And that means that they have to kind of negotiate with each other and come to a middle ground. So this is a stable system, right? If there's suddenly much more demand, then prices go up and suppliers are willing to make more of it or focus more of their resources on that particular product. If demand is very low, prices go down and the prices get much closer to this cost than to the perceived value, or the perceived value goes down, essentially. Now this inherently stable type of market, this is often called, or at least this was called by Adam Smith, by the name of the invisible hand of the market. It seems like there is some kind of governing principle doing stuff, but actually it's an emergent phenomenon of markets. Now likewise, as there is actual goods and services being traded, labor is also being traded. So the same thing applies, right? So humans have this human capital that they can sell by the hour or by the project to somebody who needs it, like a factory, who needs workers to do stuff. And if there's a lot of supply of people and labor is very cheap, if there's very little supply or you need very specific people, then labor is expensive. And by that method, the labor market is also self-regulating. And so in this very proto-form, idealistic form of capitalism, you might recognize this concept of laissez-faire capitalism. So this is something that a very well-known person called Ayn Rand conceptualized capitalism as. So as long as you just let markets do their work, they will create an equitable society, because everything is going to be valued at the right value. So prices will sort of accurately reflect value in the market. However, there are, of course, criticisms of capitalism, because as it turns out, as there are these what we can call positive emergent mechanisms that self-correct for mismatches in value, there are also what's called market failures. So ways in which markets and economies based on this capitalist idea, which is not super well defined, but by the time Karl Marx came around, was sort of well established. These concepts, they can also cause bad things to happen. Who knew? So a good example is either monopsonies or monopolies. A market can only function well if there are many consumers and many suppliers that can stay in competition with each other. Because there are many goods that there is simply always some demand for, or there is simply always very little supply of. This will cause an intrinsic mismatch between cost, value, and price of those commodities that cannot be solved by a market. You need water to exist, right? So there's basically no way around it. You need the water, but maybe there's only one supplier of this water. Well, if you need it anyway, they can just set the price as high as they like, because you are forced to buy it from them anyway. This is where you get really into an ethical quandary, because there's also this concept of stealing, right? So at a certain point, when goods are priced too high for whatever reason, and those goods, the actual cost to make those goods is much, much lower, you will get people simply stealing it or getting around it, or black markets forming, so non-sanctioned markets. That's also a whole thing. There's politics in here as well, where goods are delivered for lower prices. But if the monopoly continues to exist, let's get into the politics, right? If there is a monopoly, that monopoly might have a lot of power in the world, because they are probably a very large company. And they will be able to influence politics and let the rule makers make rules in such a way that they hold on to their monopoly powers and keep making a lot of money. All of this is a market failure. Now likewise, another sort of market failure, or really just a failure of conceptualization, is that everything has a price. So this is called commoditization. If everything that you can have has some sort of price tag to it, and there is no such thing as either an informal market or a market based on trust, everything is going through this capitalist type market, this is possibly a bad thing. Because if you conceptualize everything as a commodity, at that point, for instance, your ethics may contain value judgments on property as well. So if something is valued higher in price, you might conceptualize that as having a larger intrinsic value, a larger social value, or a larger status value. So expensive things might become desirable all of their own, even though they might not cost that much, or they might not have that much actual value to you, or actual value in a vacuum, right? Only in this system of capitalism does something like a Rolls-Royce or a diamond ring or a Rolex have that much value, because let's be honest, like this basically broken phone shows the time much better than a Rolex, right? And it can do much more. So it's like, for every type of construction of valuableness, this is much more valuable than a 50,000 euro Rolex. However, the Rolex costs more and therefore has this perceived higher value. Also, not just value in money, but value in how we think of things as being valuable to us. And this is called commodity fetishization. Commodity fetishization goes into a lot of things. It is this, fundamentally, it's just this confusion of value with price. And for instance, this can also cause some low-paid jobs to be conceived of as worse, as lower value to society than high-paid jobs, even though, for instance, I personally would not consider a banking job, so a job in the financial sector that pays really well, to be intrinsically more valuable than somebody, for instance, fixing up drainage systems. And in fact, in some cases, it might very well be that the true value to society of some engineer, or even just somebody executing work in the field outside in the rain, right, is going to be of much more immediate value and also long-term value to society. So lastly, the final pivotal criticism of capitalism by Karl Marx is the labor theory of value, and that is that the actual value created in an economy is fundamentally caused by the value put in by workers, by actual producing people. By the way, production doesn't necessarily just mean hands-on work, doesn't necessarily mean making physical things. It can also mean designing things or creating value that way, but generally it is the work, it is the human work being put into things that causes economic value to be made. And Karl Marx says that fundamentally in a capitalist society where we have these sort of market failures of pricing and valuing labor, even though fundamentally labor is where all the value comes from, this mismatch is bad in some way. So there's this value judgment on utilizing, or in this case, he explicitly called it exploiting workers for the value of their labor and not paying them exactly the value of their labor, but paying them a commodity fee for their labor, which, as I explained before, is probably contorted by the market to be lower than the actual value of their work. In fact, the whole idea is that the amount a capitalist pays to a worker is always less than the value of his labor. Now, of course, the development of this concept of capitalism didn't stop with Karl Marx and his ideas about this. Even though we often think of capitalism being mostly opposed to communism and the workers' revolt and that kind of stuff really being the antithesis to capitalism, that's not really where we stop thinking about capitalism as this one system and another system being opposed to it. Really, capitalism has still evolved in the meantime. And there are other critiques and even conceptualizations of capitalism. So instead of seeing capitalism as this confluence of Adam Smith-like invisible hand of the market and rational actors and value, cost, and price, there's this also competing idea that capitalism is a fundamentally imperialist type construct. So the idea is that we extract value from poor people, poor places, to be unequally distributed to the capitalists. So this is, for instance, part of colonial theory, or decolonialization is part of that as well. And I mean, to an extent, this is actually true. We do still these days very much feed the very rich countries of the world using resources from poor countries of the world and extracting much more value from those regions and from those people than we give them back, right? So we are not just exploiting laborers for the value of their work. We're also exploiting other countries, and we are even, there's also this concept of eco-capitalism, we are exploiting the natural resources of the world at a higher rate than is actually being replenished. And funnily enough, without actual markets being emergent in those areas, so there's no such thing as a natural resource market with the earth, right? We just extract things from the world, and to an extent we extract things from people that will not be replenished and that we don't have to give anything back for. The only reason that raw resources dug from the ground cost any money is because we have to pay somebody for their fuel, and we have to pay somebody for their machines, for their digging machines, and we have to pay for transport. That's the only costs. But we are not actually paying the cost that is incurred by the earth. And realistically, in a well-functioning, true market, we would be trying to also add those costs. And those costs, because they are not really defined within capitalism, are often called externalities. So it's an external cost. It is not something that is really priced into the normal market model. So all of these criticisms of capitalism have led to other kinds of ways to organize the economy. By the way, capitalism isn't necessarily the system that has always existed and will always exist because it is undefinable or something. We do actually have other quite distinct type systems that we have identified throughout the world. So, for instance, mercantilism is a system that existed before and currently still, like during capitalism. There's also feudalism, that it's like a politico-economic concept that sort of has some capitalist tendencies in the way that there is a person at the top that is exploiting his workers. But apart from being having identifiable criticisms of capitalism, they are distinctly not capitalist. So there are other systems. I'm not going to go into it because I really want to address these misconceptions about capitalism and communism. So if we go into communism and into its many forms, and generally into sort of anti-capitalist ideas, most anti-capitalist ideas don't do away with money, they don't do away with markets, and they don't do away with most economic ideas. So there's, I think there was even a comment on one of the first videos I had that sort of had this misconception, or maybe it wasn't a misconception, it was an actual worldview. There are non-monetary ideas of the world, and there are non-banking ideas of looking at the economy, and there are genuine ways of constructing a world without markets. But generally speaking, all economies have markets and money and these concepts as emergent phenomena. It's just almost impossible. It's maybe even something like a law of nature if you look at it from like a really foundational perspective, because supply and demand will always be a thing, and therefore markets will always be a thing. But explicitly, communism doesn't do away with money or markets. So Karl Marx did not conceive of a world without all the trappings of monetary policy. So what he really identified is that there is this large, basically unsolvable gap between value and price of labor, and that really, because foundationally labor creates all the value in the economy, then just like in democracies, we say that all the people altogether, those should be the primary distributors of power, and what happens after that, that's something you can discuss. Karl Marx said, basically all value comes from the people who do the work, So fundamentally, they have to have most of the economic power in the world. And the only way to do that, in his words, is to abolish this dichotomy between capitalists and laborers. So the laborers have to become the capitalists as well. And one way in which you can do that is to make businesses become cooperative, to become co-ops. In a co-op, there is not just one person owning the business, owning the entire intangibles of the business, but also owning the factory and all the machines and that kind of stuff, and the workers only owning their own labor. No, the workers all have this proportional part of the company in ownership as well. And don't just have the ownership, they can say what happens in the company. And that way you get rid of this way in which workers can be oppressed and exploited. And that's fundamentally all that communism is. Now, of course, a lot of you will probably have heard of this idea of the workers' revolt. This is Karl Marx's idea. Basically, he thought, well, no capitalist is going to agree to this, so the only way to do this is through war, through class war. And that is one of those things. You can say that, but there are also many leftists that don't actually think that a workers' revolt is necessary. And that gets into another part of politico-economic ideology. So Karl Marx is one of the most well-known examples of requiring a revolution to change from one system into the other. And this idea it's very prevalent, especially in young people for some reason, that in order to change the systems are so broken that it's impossible to fix them in place. So the only way forward is through a revolution, through some kind of breaking with the past and completely building from scratch a new system from better principles, and then you get a better system. This is also something that does exist on the other end of the spectrum. So usually this is a purely progressive idea. You can imagine that from a political point of view, from a political theory point of view, this is this idea that progress is necessary and we have to get at it however we can. It seems like a very progressive idea, something that right-wing, so conservative people will not like. But there are people who do think that as well, that there is a need to fundamentally break from now, and in case of a lot of right-wing political people, go back to an earlier period in the world where the world was better. So reconstruct an older type, an older system. This idea of having to basically accelerate the transition somewhat is aptly called accelerationism. And there's a corollary to this. For instance, you can change the system in place. And in fact, it is better in some way to change a system gradually, because then people can adapt to it, and moreover, you will be able to incrementally change things that are wrong and fix things as they are. Because if you start new, there is no guarantee that a new system will actually immediately work. It might take decades of tinkering again. From an accelerationist point of view, after the revolution, it might take 50 years before everything works correctly as you intended it to be. So actually it is maybe faster and maybe better in many ways, also in ways of lost life and lost value to the economy, to just incrementally do things, and that's called incrementalism. And you might have seen here that politics and economics are kind of starting to melt together at this point. There are, economics is often sort of conceived as a hard science because there's a lot of numbers and there's a lot of ways of, there's econometrics, so the idea that you can measure a lot of things very accurately in economics and at least apply statistics, right? But fundamentally, economics is a social science because we're talking about people and interactions between people. And it's very hard to make a hard science out of the behavior of people and institutions. So, being a social science, it is almost imperative that you have some kind of underlying philosophy and some kind of framework that you view things through. And a lot of these things that I've been talking about are frameworks. They are partly epistemological frameworks, but also partly ethical frameworks. And even though politics is fundamentally about power, and economics is fundamentally about value, and so in practice, in real life, you can almost not see economics and politics as separate from each other. Because, as I've shown, a lot of these underlying principles of political theories and of economic theories are shared between the two. And that's why we see such a clustering of left-wing ideas in politics and economics versus right-wing ideas in politics and economics. So I would say politico-economics should be an actual social science of itself, and not like split in two as if they can be seen separately. And of course, to put this all back into business, a business can be conceptualized as the central unit of, well, as one of the central units, as one of the actors within the politico-economic landscape. And certainly Marxism is both a political and economic entity in this way. We have economic interests, and we have ways in which we apply our ideologies to almost purely economic things within the company, but we also have our own politics that are intermingled in this entire thing and that cause us to make different economic decisions and to make different political decisions. I will not go into those in this video. That will be something for later, but I hope you enjoyed this brief look into politics, economics, and why it matters to business. Alright, see you in the next video.